Right, so what my interest is in sharing with you today is, again, what's coming down from the top. And really the thing that is most coming down from the top is policy and legislation. What I'm also interested in is how the government is held to account. So that is a combination of what used to be called select committees. Now they're just called committees, which is a bit confusing because the education committee could be anything. So I think I'll use the word select today. And the inspectorates. I just don't have time to get into the independent monitoring board, and also I don't have experience of them. So you'll excuse me, those who are connected with it, if I leave that out. The causes for concern I'm going to pick up as I get to them. They're voiced by the inspectorate, the committees, third sector organisations, and what's amazing is the amount of convergence. The same concerns are coming out again and again. And I shall do my best to find some glimmers of hope to leave you with at the end. Right, this Smarter Sentencing white paper is strange in that, as far as I'm aware, there never was a green paper. The green paper is when the ideas are bandied around and things are fairly flexible. I never saw it as a green paper, so if it was one, it came and went pretty fast. And what a lot of people are asking is why this emphasis on sentencing? This is the 18th, would you believe it, piece of legislation on sentencing. So what faith can we have that this will work when the previous 17 fell short? So let's have a look at just some of the measures, the ones that I'm going to bring out of what is a very long and complicated and detailed paper. Let's whiz through these now. I'll just give you a couple of remarks on each one. The automatic release, that means that for violent crimes, instead of coming out halfway through and serving the rest of the time in the community, it's now 2/3 of the way through. Life sentence tariffs, there is an increase in the minimum time that people will serve in prison. And these whole life orders, which now include child killers particularly, and it's going to the YOI age group, is also including terrorism acts. And what I think are very alarming, killer drivers are particularly mentioned, that they will have life sentences. So watch out for the killer drivers. People who pose a terrorist threat, and this is one terminology, who pose a terrorist threat. And this is where we start to get worried about whether Muslim people or Black people will be targeted or seen somehow as posing a threat before they have done anything. And then we do get children brought in. Number 5, that the starting point for these sentences is linked. Children's sentences are now linked to the adult scale. So we're going to find that 15 to 17-year-olds who commit murder have longer in prison. There's a lot about tightening up community sentences in this white paper. And here are a couple: the new house detention order and the curfew period that's now gone up from 12 months to 2 years. So I imagine a slightly dysfunctional family where somebody has curfews or is tagged and detained at home, when you're just desperate to push them out and get a bit of a breather. So I think the causes for concern here are fairly obvious. This massive sentence inflation, they reckon that over 10 years there has been a 40% sentence inflation overall. So our prison population, where we already have the honour of being the highest per capita in Europe, we're certainly hanging on to that place. The reason I put less chance of effective rehabilitation is just because the whole system is so very, very much overstretched. I've mentioned the disproportionate effect of what they call BAME people, but this is a subject of a later talk, so I'm not going to go into that. not only is the ageing infrastructure of prison estates something to bother us, but also the fact that so many more people are growing older in prison, so the ageing population. And prisons are just not set up for old people, infirm people, demented people. It's just not the right place. And part of this ageing infrastructure has been these construction of temporary pods, which I haven't had a sight of a temporary pod. But when a wing has been trashed after a riot, or if the building is so disgraceful that they are forced to do a bit of maintenance, people can be moved out into these pods. And I'm afraid, like so many porter cabins around the place, that they may become a permanent fixture as we find that we need more places than we have. So that is all somewhat worrying. Looking at the third sector, RR3 is the Reducing Reoffending Third Sector Alliance. So this is run from CLINCS, which is the umbrella organisation for charities in the criminal justice system, and it is input from the Criminal Justice Alliance, Prison Reform Trust, all the people that you would expect. So they're saying, where's the transparency? Where's the consultation? Why are you doing it like this without listening to us? Because we know an awful lot about it. Right, I have a guilty secret, and that is that one of my hobbies is watching the Justice Select Committee when it has its sessions. You go onto the website and it's like a YouTube thing and you listen in real time. And I always find this absolutely fascinating. And recent panels have included the ones that I've mentioned above. Let's pick out a few things from the Youth Justice panel on June the 2nd, I think it was, that it was mentioned that interventions were withdrawn overnight. It sounds a bit like the female estate. And so very needy, very vulnerable children suddenly found that everything they relied on seemed to have disappeared. The speakers made the point that while vulnerable children in custody might get to school, vulnerable children in the community would have schooling still during COVID. Young people in custody would not have anything, and there was tremendous lack of occupation. A surprisingly few number of young people benefited from this early release scheme under COVID. And even more worryingly, in a way, that those that were released under investigation, a lot of them just seemed to disappear altogether. So nobody knew how they were managing or what was going on. And a damning comment by Angus Mulready, who's Her Majesty's Inspector for Prisons with responsibility for children and young adults, he said the custodial estate is not fit for purpose. The most interesting Justice Committee hearing that I've listened in on is when all the criminal justice chief inspectors were rounded up. This was last month. So you had the head of prison probation, Crown Prosecution Service and Constabulary. And so what they were talking on was a report that they produced, which was embargoed and then suddenly released, I think, the day before this hearing, on their response to the criminal justice system's response to COVID-19. So what did they shine the spotlight on? It was this unprecedented and long-term impact of the courts. So it might be interesting to point out that this unprecedented backlog, 2/3 of it existed pre-COVID. And this is where the Secretary of State, and also Lord Chancellor, Secretary of State for the Ministry of Justice and Lord Chancellor Robert Buckland had piped up previously in the June panel to say that he had signed off 10 Nightingale courts. He was reorganising magistrates' courts to take Crown Court cases where possible. The backlog would be dealt with by Easter 2021, not long to go now. And he also was very proud of all the increased digital innovation. So this meant there could be remote hearings. But the panel members pointed out that although this might seem to get the numbers down and move things on, actually more in obviously non-criminal cases, the issues that arose were people who had no suitable technology at home, because you need the tablet for the hearing and then some way of downloading a massive amount of court documents. We've got the family distractions. And interestingly, people don't take something as seriously if it's happening on Zoom as though it's happening as it happening in a sort of intimidating court setting. So again and again, people were saying, you know, this doesn't seem to be quite having the desired effect, sitting at home with your feet up in your jogging suit while this hearing is going on. That really does affect you. Something else that Robert Buckland thought was very helpful were out-of-court disposals. But again, people don't realise necessarily that this is serious and that this can leave you with a criminal record. So some very interesting things coming out of this. A lot of concern arose for people who were remanded to custody. As their trials move further and further into the future, there's a worrying trend that they would just plead guilty because they reckon their sentence would be shorter if they pleaded guilty than if they stayed in prison, which had an effect on their family. They would lose their employment and just the health aspect of being in prison. So people apparently were pleading guilty to get a short sentence, to get it over with, rather than hanging around in prison waiting for 2022, 2023 for their trials. So 2 quotes, I think, to end you with. One is a whole system problem. It's not just the courts, it's not just the prisons. And this other very telling quote: every part of the criminal justice system is struggling. And what they say in their joint inspection report is delays mean victims wait longer for cases to be heard. Some withdraw support for prosecution because they've lost faith in the process. Witnesses find it difficult to recall events that took place many months or even years ago. Prosecutors waste periods of time preparing for cases that do not go ahead. Those accused of crimes face delays in their opportunities to defend themselves. Defendants are kept on remand for longer periods. So extremely satisfactory all round. You might remember Margaret Hodge used to chair this committee. She's yielded her slot as the chair of Public Accounts Select Committee to Meg Hillier, who is also doing a very good job. So let's see what's happening here. They have produced a report on the prison estate and the failure to improve living conditions. It really is the most damning thing I've ever read in my life. I've just pulled out 4 issues here that I think speak for themselves. Give you a chance to read those 4. And remember that figure 900 million plus the costs of the maintenance backlog. And some of this I think we put down to the failure of Carillion, who had the contract to do a lot of prison maintenance. The overcrowding is something that we're all very aware of, and apparently there are 10 prisons running at 147%, so that means 147% of intended capacity. So let's have a look at the conclusions. So there may be funding in the capital budget for the maintenance, but because of crises continually erupting through failure to think ahead, this funding gets moved across all the time. Neglect of the female estate. I think Polly has got us started thinking about this. For example, there's no facilities in Wales, so often people are a long way from home. The committee brought out the lack of cross-government strategy, and they said this put the efforts to reduce reoffending worked out as costing £18.1 billion a year. A most astronomical figure. It used to be 13, which blew my mind. It's now 18. Prisons have not recovered from 2015. Well, what happened then? You remember the name Chris Grayling, who decided, made the most catastrophic misjudgment, deciding that somehow prisons could run with a reduction of at least 25% of their prison officers. So what happens? The older ones and the more experienced ones retire. And in the future, from 2015, the attempts to bring the numbers back up to just something like a sort of operational capacity means you're getting obviously younger and less experienced people into the job. And it's caused problems in all areas of prisons. Government seems to love outsourcing things. So the committee described as naive this continual attempt to outsource problems rather than resolve them. And then we can see that the increasing prisoners' numbers are incompatible with safety. And in every one of these areas, these conclusions and recommendations, the Ministry of Justice was asked to report back. So Meg Hillier, the scale of failure in our prisons and the disastrous probation reforms, and including the prison officer reforms, is really quite staggering. The apparent disregard for the position of women is just another indictment of a clearly broken system. We are still reeling from the long-term consequences of the unrealistic 2015 spending review settlement. But our whole society is bearing the financial and human cost of sustained underinvestment. Even now, we're not convinced that MOJ and Her Majesty's Prison and Probation Service, HMPPS, have the ingredients for an effective, sustainable long-term strategy. We now expect a set of reports over the coming months assessing the realistic costs of mistakes, how to fix them, and a credible new plan. We want a system that can reduce reoffending, not just lock people into this cycle of violence and harm. Well, I've never heard anything more damning than that. So there is this follow-up. So if we're wondering what kind of teeth these committees have, they're often chaired by quite powerful backbenchers. And it's interesting to see people like the Lord Chancellor, being very humble when he's asked these pointed questions. Let's just quick have a look at these spending review settlements and see what the most recent one is. Robert Buckland is very proud of this. All these additional prison places, hooray. But look at the next figure, 315 million capital funding. What was it the Public Accounts Committee said we needed? 900 million plus. So nothing like enough to repair the damage. More police officers, as Polly has mentioned, and then more money for the courts. So obvious causes for concern is the kind of pipeline. You get more police, you get more prosecutions, you get more people being sentenced, so more pressure on the courts, you get more people in prison. The parole board and the probation all have to gear up for bigger numbers. I say the MOJ is an unprotected government department. I mean that unlike Education and Department of Health, their budget is not secured, so it's always at risk. And then an interesting comment, again from the Justice Select Committee, I think, is that there are no votes in the criminal justice system. So all the demands after COVID on funding, on the Treasury, mean that people are suspecting that the criminal justice system is not going to have much of a priority. Let me move on now quickly to the Education Committee. They have just opened an inquiry, are prisoners being left behind? All the responses are on the Education Committee website, including my response. But I just wanted to quickly look at other education issues in prisons. And you see that I'm saying here, lack of classes during COVID. Some prisoners aren't even receiving books. For some reason, the OU hasn't adapted particularly well, and residents in prison are very worried that they're not able to get on with their sentence and do the offender behaviour programme requirements that are on their sentence plan. And so they get to the end of their sentence and they haven't had the resettlement input and they haven't done the programmes that they need to do. The digital technology is moving apace, but in a very uneven way. Having a video link with your family may be better than nothing, but some people actually find it very distressing to be able to see their family, but kind of not have them. Apparently power cuts are not unusual, which get people extremely frustrated. There's something new called self-service kiosks in some prisons, which seem to be getting the thumbs up. And then the virtual campus. This is a huge programme to support independent learning, which is continually being refreshed, but it's the idea is that people can learn at their own paces, but they can't if they don't have the technology. So certainly in Long Lartin, the computers are in education. If you're not on education, you can't get onto the virtual campus. So let's see who may be getting excluded from the digital innovations. And these are the two groups that come to mind. Right. Another area I just want to touch on quickly is government moves to support employment. The New Futures Network I first heard about in March 2019. Last month there was another Zoom conference, not conference, webinar from the New Futures Network. And they don't seem to have moved on very much. They are covering just a limited group of sectors, employment sectors, with work coaches and ambassadors and employment brokers. But far more interesting, I think, is this peer initiative, a careers project started by a man who was in for a white collar crime. And what he said are that any careers help, any resettlement employment help must address these causes for concern. And this is really his experience of the men that surrounded him and who he helped. They don't regard themselves as having any skills, although they might have been a library orderly or done all sorts of things. The rates of trauma are astronomical. They actually need to be readapted, and there's all sorts of things as they readapt to the life outside. So he's saying support must be trauma-based, and there must be an awareness that when you're constrained like this, you almost get a sort of OCD because you control so little that you start to really focus on what you can control. And the criminal record dealing with disclosure is another area. Right, let me just move on to the outgoing Chief Inspector of Prisons, Peter Clark, and I realise I'm getting a bit short of time, but I do need to just whiz through this, because what he said is that prisons have been given a lot more autonomy after the National Offender Management Service was laid down, and governors should be, under the 2019 reforms, very much commissioning the services that they need. But somehow they're not used to autonomy and they're not really grasping it. And of the Prison Officers Association, he said they are insular, they're not receptive to criticism, they protect their own, and they see the inspectorate as an unwelcome distraction. So obviously ongoing difficulties of culture there. Which two areas have underperformed more than any others? It's the continued lack of purposeful activity that I remember his predecessor, Nick Hardwick, talking about. And with rehabilitation, Peter Clark said, we know what doesn't work, but we don't know what does work. And I suppose the one power he does have is that prisons that fail on all counts have this sanction of urgent notification, like Feltham has been under, where the Secretary of State take them over like a failed school. And I think the other two remarks you can have a look at as I move hastily to my very last slide, where I've tried to find a little bit of hope. Oh no, sorry, Charlie Taylor first. Let's see what Charlie Taylor had to say. He felt that in the first lockdown, people seem to be managing, but in the second one, they're doing a lot worse. So mental health, emotional well-being, psychological well-being, physical well-being, and that somehow the intimidation and bullying is still happening, but in a different way. As far as resettlement is concerned, he brought out two things, and this thematic review is well worth reading. It's not all that long. And his final comments. And this last one is very sad. In our field work, we saw an ingrained sense of hopelessness and helplessness. And he said this is going to move over to rehabilitation efforts if we don't, if we're not careful. So a few bits of help actually from the white paper. Hopefully, this intention to use problem-solving courts, we're going to see that. Community centres treatment requirements have a very low take-up, so hopefully with more funding, there will be a better take-up. In my area, I'm delighted that actually in the white paper itself, they're calling evidence, they have called for evidence for neurodiversity, and they're now having white round tables, and I took place in one 2 days ago. So this is looking at my area of dyslexia, dyspraxia, etc. In fact, I had to respond to everything I'd done since 1995 in that call for evidence. So that really did me in. Many third sector organisations like the Toe by Toe Reading Plan, Shannon Trust have sent in packs. Prison Phoenix Trust has been extremely proactive. And of course, we have the excellent work of the select committees. So one thing to leave you with, what about this Royal Commission in the Queen's speech? If I could do the Queen's voice, I would read it out. My ministers, I can't do the Queen's voice. So there is this intent that's been announced to establish a Royal Commission, but nothing about it. We don't know when, and we don't know its remit. So sorry about the speed of racing through. I will now stop sharing my screen, and I can assure you that there will be the chance to see all these slides later.